Joining me now is Joel Pollak, senior editor-at-large at Breitbart.com, one of the first American journalists to cover the story and really to introduce it to an international audience. It's become a huge story, the trucker rebellion, in the United States, and indeed it's spread around the world. These images of a trucker convoy in Israel are amazing. Israel, one of the most jabbed countries in the world. Joining us now via Skype is Joel. Joel, how are you doing? And thank you for following this story. Mostly American journalists, they don't really find Canada a source of interesting commentary, but you really have sunk your teeth into it.
Well, when American journalists have covered the Canadian trucker story, they tend to have done so the way the Canadian media have done so. In fact, if you watch the White House press briefings over the last several days, you would have seen journalists pressing Biden to oppose the Canadian truckers and to use stronger language against the Canadian truckers. Very few journalists in our establishment media understand what this is about, or maybe they do understand that it is a rebellion of sorts against the elites who run our countries, and they, being part of the elite, don't particularly like it. But Washington, D.C. is dropping its vaccine mandate, the latest blue domino to fall down here, where California, New York, other states, Illinois, they're all dropping mandates because they are seeing the backlash, and the Canadian truckers are the most visible evidence of that. So there's been a huge impact. There's also going to be a continuing impact on politics in this country, regardless of what Justin Trudeau does, because I was up in Northern California last week, and there are conservatives talking about organizing trucking convoys into March, later in the spring. These convoys are becoming a symbol that is going to transcend the current crisis. So no matter what Trudeau does, how the Canadian issue is resolved, this has become the new Tea Party. We are all truckers now, in a sense. And of course, truckers were heroes 2 years ago in the early days of the pandemic, when people were worried that there wouldn't be enough food on the shelves of grocery stores. The supply chains were crucial in maintaining public calm, in keeping people connected. And they were heroes. I interviewed truckers on my radio show. We have a lot of truckers in our audience on Sirius XM 125. But truckers are not just heroes during the pandemic. You can't just dump them when they're no longer useful to your political agenda, which is what Trudeau has done. A year ago, Trudeau was telling people that mandates would be extreme and divisive. Now he is pursuing them in an extreme and divisive way. And his party seems to be applauding every step of the way. I see that there was a motion in the Canadian Parliament that went through where the Liberals and the NDP joined together to oppose a motion to support the ending, or at least a strategy to end, the COVID lockdowns and mandates and so forth. In this country, Democrats are now talking about supporting those kinds of policies because they are fearful of the midterm elections, and they see what the Canadian truckers have done. And look, they know that there's a huge number of swing votes. They learned the hard way in November when a trucker in New Jersey knocked off the Democratic State Senate president, a trucker who spent about $10,000 of his own money to run for state Senate. So there is a serious sense of momentum behind the truckers in this country starting to be inspired by what Canadian truckers did, and they've become sort of a working class symbol of rebellion against the elites. The elites are very worried in this country, and this is going to continue no matter how the present crisis is resolved in Canada.
Well, what I'm worried about is in Canada, this Emergency Act being deployed. It's been more than 50 years since this law has been deployed in Canada. 52 years ago, Justin Trudeau's father brought in the War Measures Act, but in that case, there was actual separatist terrorism. There were murders and kidnappings and bombs in mailboxes. It was the FLQ, the Front de Liberation de Quebec. Here, there's none of that. There's been no acts of violence in 2 weeks with 100,000 truckers. Last night, RCMP in Coutts, Alberta, arrested 11 people claiming there was a violent cell. Now, could be, but I know that in rural Alberta, the idea that you have some long arms, like some shotguns and rifles in a house, is not a sign of being a violent cell. That's sort of what farms and ranches are like. There's no police station nearby. You need them for pest control, like a coyote or something. So I don't know if there really was a violent cell. I think it may be that was just a pretext to bring in this kind of martial law. And I note that Trudeau calls anyone he doesn't like a Nazi, yet he's removing civil liberties. Here's what I'm worried about, Joel, is that the narrative that the left has had in America about January 6th insurrectionists has been imported to Canada. It didn't really fit the peaceful truckers, but they're going to try and call these truckers domestic violent extremists. They're going to call them some sort of terrorists. They're going to justify some sort of domestic Patriot Act style surveillance and restriction of civil liberties for anyone who's a conservative. I'm really worried about that. And I think that's in Trudeau's blood. I think that it's what his father was like and what his own heroes from Fidel Castro to China are like.
Well, I think you're right to be worried, but I also think that no democratically elected leader in a country with a reasonably free press can get away with using emergency powers to get rid of the opposition. And the difference between the Canadian truckers and January 6th is that the protesters on January 6th and the rioters who invaded the Capitol, they were proceeding based on a speculative theory that the election had been stolen and that it could somehow be reversed through sending it back to the states if they disrupted a particular proceeding and so forth. It was all speculation and not all of it well-founded, to put it mildly. But in Canada, it's a very clear pretext. There's a very clear provocation, which is the vaccine mandate for truckers. And all Trudeau would have to do to end the quote-unquote emergency is end the vaccine mandate. We've seen other vaccine mandates, other coronavirus policies fall in other provinces, Ontario, Alberta, other places, and not necessarily to the full satisfaction of the people involved, but there's been some reaction. And Trudeau is refusing to do that. What he's telling Canadians, and I think liberal Americans, is that if you give in to these tactics, then there's no limit. It becomes a slippery slope. These truckers, these hooligans, insurrectionists will rise up every time there's something they don't like. But that's a very hard sell if you're going to use emergency powers more broadly. I don't think he's going to get away with it. And I think that let's go there. Let's go to the question of violence. The reason that the Canadian Charter of Freedoms allows for peaceful assembly and so forth is that in countries that provide freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, freedom to protest and so forth, you don't need violence to make your voice heard. You don't need to use acts of sabotage to be listened to. When you use emergency powers to crack down on what is really a peaceful protest, maybe not a lawful protest in every case, but it's basically civil disobedience. When you use emergency powers to crack down on that, you almost guarantee more violence. There are going to be a small group of people within, whether the left or the right, who see the imposition of emergency powers as something that precludes ordinary political debate, precludes freedom of speech and assembly, and they're going to take matters into their own hands. That is the response historically of people on the fringes, but people nonetheless, to the imposition of emergency powers by government, especially when large swaths of the population see those emergency powers as illegitimate. And I've seen polls that say that something like 2/3 of Canadians like the idea of using these sort of extraordinary powers to remove the truckers, but at the same time, nearly half of Canadians empathize with the cause of the truckers, with the cause of the protest. So maybe people want this to be over with. But the quickest way to end it would be for Justin Trudeau to compromise in some way, to stand down, and to allow life to return to normal. This pandemic is basically on its way out. If you look at the infection numbers in the United States, they're plummeting, just as the Omicron wave has risen and fallen in the rest of the world. So maybe in the long run, Trudeau saves face, perhaps if he just does nothing. And he allows the Omicron wave to pass, and then he says, okay, well, I'm removing the mandates because they're not necessary anymore. We don't have the same degree of a problem that we once did. That, to me, seems the safer route. He's going to provoke opposition, some of which will be vociferous and loud and more honking, let's say, from truckers and so forth. The problem is that when you invoke these emergency powers, you create this element of radicalism. And you see that in the United States when the federal government starts talking about seizing guns, for example, or you have a botched FBI raid, such as the one that happened under Bill Clinton in Waco, Texas. You see people on the fringes start to react to that sort of thing. And there were subsequent acts of right-wing domestic terrorism in the wake of Waco because they thought that the federal government had essentially impose totalitarian rule on the United States. It's a crazy belief, but when the government oversteps its authority, people's imaginations can run wild. And I think that Trudeau is destabilizing a situation that actually has a natural and safe resolution, which he is unwilling to pursue because he's aware that he will pay a political price, both with the conservative opposition and within his own liberal camp, for backing down. But I don't think for the good of the Canadian people, there's any real alternative to backing down. Declaring emergency powers is a way of escalating and destabilizing a situation. It's almost a guarantee of violence. And it's really a stupid thing to do, but here we are.
You know, I'm worried that he wants that because, of course, he has always succeeded by polarizing, by calling his enemies, racist, sexist, misogynist, Nazis, whatever. That's how he works. I saw a poll that put him at 16%. So he needs things to be more extreme. Let me close on this note. The truckers, the most peaceful mass movement in maybe Canadian history. So they raised $10 million in GoFundMe, and the various governments in Canada caused that to be rescinded. They interfered and got GoFundMe to cancel it. Then the truckers went to Give, Send, Go. They couldn't be deplatformed, although they were hacked. But then they went to court and got an order freezing those funds. Trudeau 2 weeks ago introduced a new internet censorship bill that will explicitly target news sites like ours. And today the Emergency Act is brought in. All of these things make Canada less free. And as you mentioned, this motion in Parliament today to have some exit plan failed. Trudeau wants a permanent revolution. He wants a permanent emergency. Joel, I got to tell you, I am worried that Canada is becoming unfree. It can happen. I mean, Argentina, Venezuela, there are countries that become less free. And it's hard to imagine that a great country like Canada could be that way. But I don't know if we have enough checks and balances in our own country to stop a would-be, I don't want to say tyrant, but a petty tyrant, I think, is accurate. I just don't know what Canadians should do. I don't want any violence. But what do you do when every single fail-safe, every check and balance doesn't work? And when people go to a general strike, that's what I'd call this trucker rebellion, sort of a wildcat general strike, peaceful. And when you do that, they're all called terrorists and they bring in an emergency law. I just don't know what Canadians should do. And I don't know what Americans might think of your closest ally and neighbor and friend really throwing away freedom.
Well, I think this is a very speculative response to your question, but I think that Canada's territorial size makes the imposition of totalitarian rule unlikely. It's likelier in the more urbane areas of Canada, Toronto, Ottawa, and so forth. But I think there's a large portion of Canada geographically that would refuse to live under such a regime if it continued in that direction. Already with the movement in Quebec to separate, which has gone back many decades, there was talk of Canadian provinces seceding to join the United States if that were the case. That may be on the table. There may be some greater regionalism that is demanded, at least, by some of the provinces. We've already seen some provinces come out and say they oppose the imposition of Trudeau using emergency powers and so forth. Trudeau may provoke a kind of response by some of these provinces to oppose him and to consider other political alternatives. These are sort of things you do in extremis. But if Trudeau and the people who support him are willing to go to those extremes, then you start to have a conversation about that. And people are saying, when we talk about Ukraine and Russia, the real issue in geopolitics today is what looks like almost a civil war in Canada, at least from abroad. So I think that a division is likelier than a complete successful suppression of dissent. Also, if Trudeau's poll numbers are so low, I don't know that much of what he says about the opposition has credibility anymore. But I think if I were one of the truckers, what I would be doing is trying to build alliances with the constituencies that are often within the Liberal camp but are persuadable. See if the truckers can form the core of a new opposition that can isolate Trudeau. Look, what's happened in this country is Joe Biden has become isolated. Until January 2021, the entire Democratic Party was behind him. Now that things are going very, very poorly, not just the mess in Canada, but Russia, Ukraine, Afghanistan, inflation, all the things that are going wrong, there are local Democratic leaders who won't be seen in public with Joe Biden. He's toxic to them. I think you have to toxify Justin Trudeau, and you have to do it in a way that also presents an alternative. So you have to start showing people that there really is a different way to do things and give it some time to develop, but reach out to moderates or even to some core parts of the Liberal constituency that may have some strong disagreements with Trudeau for various reasons and say, look, we need to isolate this guy because he's so damaging to the country. I think that would be a good strategy. The truckers don't seem to have any central leadership and so forth, and the conservative opposition seems to be in some disarray. But I think that's the next step if this is to be successful, is for a broader movement to emerge that uses this rebellion or this protest, this general strike as a kind of foundation. But at the very least, Trudeau seems to have lost control of his own country. That's an opportunity for the opposition to reorganize and realign so that it can isolate him and then create some divisions within that Liberal coalition that today was cheering the passage of a bill or the failure of a bill to promote an exit from COVID. You have to start finding the fault lines. Right now, the fault lines within the Democratic Party here in the United States and in Biden's base are there, and they're growing and they're visible. People don't want to be seen with him. You have to do that with Trudeau as well. And I don't think Trudeau is a particularly charismatic person or has the ability to bridge those divides. He relies on the loyalty of a particular cultural constituency. Once you start shattering that, I think more things become possible.
Very interesting. I appreciate your outside perspective. I think you're very right to refer to regional differences. I know Alberta separatism was already high because of Trudeau's war on the oil patch and the carbon tax and his general disrespect for the West. I think you're also very wise to point out that there's a tremendous problem with the disarray of the so-called conservatives in this country. It'll be interesting for us at Rebel News to see what role we play. I mean, we're trying to tell the story, which I think is an important building block. We have crowdfunded some civil liberties lawyers. I just checked moments ago. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association, which is our version of the ACLU, they haven't had a press release, a tweet, any public statement in 5 days. They just
that is very much like the ACLU. Civil liberties are what they say they stand for until there are actual civil liberties at stake.
Yeah. It's just incredible. Well, Joel, thank you so much for your time and your perspective, and it's great to have you on again, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Ezra.
That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.